The left luggage office at Brighton railway station smelled of tobacco and sea salt. June sun slanted through the dusty windows. The clerk had noticed it 3 days prior. Trunk number 102, unclaimed, beginning to leak a dark stain across the concrete floor. The smell had grown worse with the heat. Flies gathered at the brass lock. On the 17th of June 1934, the clerk telephoned the railway police. They arrived with crowbars and handkerchiefs pressed to their faces. The lock broke easily. The lid swung open. Inside, wrapped in brown paper and cotton wadding, packed with care as one might preserve fragile china, lay the torso of a woman. No head, no limbs, only the pale curve of a rib cage and the terrible precision of the cuts. The paper had been tied with string. Someone had taken their time. Outside, the Brighton holidaymakers walked the promenade in summer hats, unaware that beneath the cheerful facade of England's favourite seaside resort, something unspeakable had arrived by train. The clerk stared at the trunk. The flies continued their low drone, and in the sudden silence of that small office, the seaside town's darkest mystery began to unfold. Chapter 1. The Trunk at Platform 5. Good evening, and welcome to the Bedside Historian. Wherever you are listening tonight, perhaps in the quiet of your room or in the gentle darkness before sleep, I am glad you have found your way here. What hour marks your clock as these words reach you? Is it the deep night, or that soft threshold between waking and dreaming? No matter the time, let this be a place of stillness. If you have not yet subscribed to this channel, I invite you to do so now. It helps us grow, helps us continue these journeys into the past, and I'm grateful for each of you who chooses to walk these shadowed paths with me. Tonight's story is one that haunted a seaside town through a summer that should have been filled with laughter and salt air, but instead became marked by a mystery so dark that even now, nearly a century later, it has never been solved. So, settle in. Let the world grow quiet. And let us drift backward to England in the year 1934, to a railway station on the Sussex coast, where something terrible waited in the shadows. The Brighton railway station stood as it had for decades, a Victorian structure of iron and glass that served as the gateway to England's most beloved seaside resort. In June of 1934, the station hummed with its usual summer traffic. Families arrived with luggage and children, seeking the beaches and piers that made Brighton famous. The air smelled of coal smoke and sea wind. Platform 5 stretched long and busy, and at its far end, tucked beneath an archway, sat the left luggage office, a small room where travellers could leave their trunks and cases for a few pence while they explored the town. The clerk who minded this office was a man named William Vinicum, middle-aged and methodical, who kept careful records of every item deposited in his care. He had worked this position for 7 years and prided himself on his attention to detail. Each trunk received a numbered ticket. Each ticket was logged in a ledger. Each unclaimed item was tracked with the precision of a bank account. On the 10th of June, a trunk had arrived, a cheap brown case bound with rope, measuring approximately 2 feet by 1 foot by 18 inches. The person who deposited it had been unremarkable enough that Vinicum could not later recall a face or voice with certainty. The deposit fee was paid. Ticket number 102 was issued. The trunk was placed on a shelf in the dim storage room. 3 days passed. The trunk remained unclaimed. This was not unusual. Travellers sometimes forgot their luggage or changed their plans or simply delayed their return. But on the 13th of June, Vinicum noticed something that troubled him. The trunk had developed a dark stain along its bottom edge. The stain was spreading slowly across the concrete floor beneath it. The smell, faint at first, had grown more pronounced with each passing day. By the 15th of June, flies had begun to gather. They clustered at the brass lock and along the seams where the lid met the base. The odour had become unmistakable, not the mustiness of old clothes or damp leather, but something organic and corrupting, something that made Vinicum's stomach turn when he entered the storage room. On the morning of the 17th of June, Vinicum made his decision. He telephoned the railway police. 2 constables arrived within the hour, their faces sceptical until they entered the storage room and smelled what Vinicum had been enduring for days. They agreed immediately that the trunk must be opened. The formality of lost property procedures was abandoned. One constable fetched a crowbar. The other propped open the door to let fresh air circulate. Vinicum stood at a distance. Handkerchief pressed to his nose as the constables approached trunk number 102. The lock was cheap and broke easily under pressure. The rope binding was cut with a knife. One constable positioned himself on either side of the trunk. They lifted the lid. For a moment nobody spoke. The smell rushed out like something physical, filling the small room with a sweetness that was also rot, a presence that seemed to displace the very air. Inside the trunk, wrapped carefully in brown paper and cotton wadding, packed with a care that suggested both planning and deliberation, lay the torso of a human being. There was no head, there were no arms, there were no legs, only the pale curve of a ribcage, the flesh partially decomposed but still recognizably human, the cuts precise and deliberate, showing no ragged edges or hesitation. The paper wrapping had been tied with ordinary string, the kind one might use to wrap a parcel for posting. Whoever had prepared this package had done so methodically, almost clinically, as if transporting a medical specimen rather than committing murder. The cotton wadding suggested an attempt to absorb fluids, to prevent leakage, to maintain the trunk's innocent appearance for as long as possible. The constable stepped back. One of them went outside and was briefly sick against the station wall. The other remained, staring at the contents of the trunk, trying to reconcile what he was seeing with the cheerful bustle of the railway station beyond the storage room door. Families were still arriving, children were still laughing. The summer sun still slanted through the dusty windows, but here, in this small room beneath the archway of Platform 5, Brighton's darkest hour had begun. Within an hour, the left luggage office had been cordoned off. Railway police telephoned the Brighton Constabulary. Brighton Constabulary telephoned Scotland Yard. Detectives arrived. A police surgeon was summoned. The trunk was carefully photographed in situ before being transported to the Brighton mortuary. By afternoon, the news had reached the local papers. By evening, it had reached London. By the following morning, newspapers across England carried the story with headlines that mixed horror and fascination in equal measure. Torso found in Brighton trunk. Dismembered body at Seaside station. Mystery of trunk crime. The police surgeon who examined the remains was Dr. Henry Bainbridge, a man experienced in post-mortem examination but unprepared for the particular horror of this case. His initial report, delivered that evening to the gathering detectives, provided the first concrete facts. The remains were those of a woman, approximately 25 to 30 years of age. She had been dead approximately 2 weeks, though the exact time was difficult to determine due to decomposition and the possibility that the body had been kept in a cool place before being packed in the trunk. The dismemberment had been carried out with considerable skill. The cuts showed knowledge of anatomy. The joints had been disarticulated cleanly, suggesting either medical knowledge or experience in butchery. There were no defensive wounds visible on the torso. The cause of death could not be determined without the head and other missing parts. Detective Inspector Arthur Stacey of the Brighton Police took immediate charge of the investigation. He was a careful man, known for his methodical approach and his refusal to jump to conclusions. That first evening, as the mortuary lights burned late and the seafront emptied of its holiday makers, Stacey gathered his team and began to organise what would become one of the most intensive manhunts in English criminal history. The first priority was identification. Without a head, without dental records or facial features, they would need to rely on other markers. The body showed no distinctive scars or birthmarks. The hands and feet were missing, so fingerprints were impossible. They had only the torso itself, female, young, carefully dismembered and carefully wrapped, the second priority was the trunk itself. It was examined with forensic precision. The wood was cheap deal sold by the thousands in shops across England. The rope binding was ordinary hemp, again available anywhere. The brown paper was standard wrapping paper, the kind used in grocers and stationers throughout the country. The cotton wadding was perhaps more distinctive. It suggested medical supplies, or perhaps a chemist's shop. But none of these items bore manufacturer's marks or unique identifiers. The trunk might have been purchased in Brighton or London or any town between. The killer had been careful. Everything was generic. Everything was untraceable. The left luggage ticket provided one slim lead. Ticket number 102 had been issued on the 10th of June. The clerk, Vinicum, was questioned extensively. He remembered the deposit vaguely. A trunk brought in during the afternoon, the fee paid in coins, the ticket issued. But the person who deposited it had made no impression on him whatsoever. Man or woman, he could not say with certainty. Young or old? Average, he thought. Nothing distinctive. Nothing memorable. Thousands of people pass through the left luggage office every week during the summer season. This depositor had been deliberately unremarkable, or perhaps Vinicum had simply been too busy to notice. Either way, the trail ended there, at the ticket counter, dissolving into the anonymous crowds that filled Brighton railway station every summer day. By nightfall on the 17th of June, Brighton had transformed from a place of pleasure into a place of suspicion. The promenade still glittered with electric lights. The pier still extended into the dark water, but beneath the surface something had changed. Police constables began visiting every lodging house, every boarding room, every hotel in the town. They carried descriptions of the torso, approximate height, approximate weight, approximate age. They asked landladies if any female guests had gone missing. They checked registers and questioned servants. They walked the streets where women worked at night, asking if any of their number had vanished. The investigation spread through Brighton like ink through water, touching everything, staining everything, as the town's cheerful facade began to crack and reveal the shadows beneath. In the mortuary, Dr. Bainbridge continued his examination. The woman in the trunk had been young and healthy before her death. Her organs showed no disease. Her bones showed no old injuries. She had not been pregnant. She appeared to have been well nourished, suggesting she had not been living in poverty. These facts were entered into the growing file, but they provided no name, no identity, no connection to the living world. She remained simply the trunk victim, a phrase that would echo through the summer and beyond, becoming shorthand for a horror that defied explanation. The Brighton Evening Argus published a special edition. The story dominated the front page. Already theories were beginning to circulate. Some suggested the work of a doctor gone mad. Others whispered about illegal surgeries and abortions gone wrong. Still others imagined foreign criminals, gangs from London's underworld using Brighton as a dumping ground. The speculation was endless, and none of it was founded on evidence. Detective Inspector Stacey ignored the theories and focused on the facts. A woman had been murdered. Her body had been expertly dismembered. The remains had been carefully packed and transported to a railway station. The killer had walked through Brighton in broad daylight, carrying a trunk filled with human remains, and no one had noticed. Somewhere in this seaside town, or perhaps in London, or perhaps anywhere in England, a murderer was continuing their ordinary life, confident that the trunk's secret would never be discovered, or if discovered, never traced back to them. As midnight approached on that first day, Stacey stood alone in his office at Brighton Police Station. Before him lay the case file, already growing thick with witness statements and forensic reports. Outside, the sound of the sea could be heard, that eternal rhythm that had soothed countless visitors to Brighton's shores. But tonight, the sound seemed different, less like comfort and more like the whisper of secrets the water would never reveal. The trunk at platform 5 had opened a door into darkness, and Stacey understood, with the certainty of long experience, that this case would not be solved quickly if it was solved at all. Somewhere, a killer waited. Somewhere, the missing parts of a young woman's body lay hidden. And somewhere, perhaps, someone knew her name. Chapter 2. The Seaside's Shadow. The morning of the 18th of June dawned grey and humid over Brighton. The usual crowds began to gather on the beaches, but something had shifted in the town's atmosphere. News of the trunk discovery spread through boarding houses and hotels with the speed of contagion. Landladies whispered to their guests over breakfast. Shopkeepers discussed it across counters. The Brighton Evening Argus sold out its morning edition within hours. By mid-morning, journalists from London newspapers had descended upon the town, setting up in the hotels along the seafront, buttonholing police constables for information, offering money to anyone who might provide a detail not yet published. Detective Inspector Stacey understood that he needed assistance beyond what the Brighton Constabulary could provide. At 9 o'clock that morning, he placed a telephone call to Scotland Yard. He spoke with careful precision, outlining the facts without embellishment. A dismembered female torso. Expert dismemberment. No identification possible. No witnesses. No clear motive. The voice on the other end of the line listened in silence, then promised to send their most experienced detective. By afternoon, the London train would bring reinforcements. At the mortuary, Dr. Bainbridge had worked through the night. His report, completed by dawn, provided additional details that deepened the mystery rather than solving it. The woman had died approximately 14 days before her discovery, placing the murder around the 3rd or 4th of June. The body had been kept somewhere cool after death, perhaps a cellar or icehouse, which had slowed decomposition and made precise timing difficult. The dismemberment had occurred within 24 hours of death, while the body was still fresh. The cuts had been made with a sharp instrument, probably a knife with a blade at least 6 inches long. The person who wielded it had known exactly where to cut. Each limb had been removed at the joint, shoulder, hip, neck, with no sawing through bone, no hesitation marks, no false starts. This surgical precision troubled Bainbridge deeply. In his 20 years of medical practice, he had seen many violent deaths, but few showed such technical competence. The killer was either a doctor, a medical student, a butcher, or someone with anatomical training gained through military service, or perhaps work in an abattoir. The field of suspects was both broad and specific. Thousands of men in England possess such skills, but few would have the particular combination of knowledge and coldness required to dismember a human body with such methodical care. The stomach contents provided another clue. The woman's last meal had been consumed approximately 3 to 4 hours before death. It consisted of partially digested food that Bainbridge identified as chicken and vegetables, suggesting a proper meal rather than street food or casual eating. This indicated she had dined somewhere, a restaurant, a boarding house, or perhaps a private residence, on the evening of her death. The police began canvassing every eating establishment in Brighton, asking if anyone remembered serving a young woman on the 3rd or 4th of June. The responses were predictably unhelpful. Dozens of young women dined in Brighton every evening during the summer season. Without a face or a name, the inquiry led nowhere. Detective Chief Inspector Robert Donaldson arrived from Scotland Yard on the afternoon train. He was 53 years old, grey-haired, with the patient manner of a man who had spent 3 decades investigating murders and understood that solutions came through persistence rather than inspiration. Stacey met him at the railway station, the same station where trunk number 102 had waited in the left luggage office, and escorted him directly to the mortuary. Donaldson examined the remains in silence, his face revealing nothing. Afterward, in Stacey's office, he reviewed the case file with the same methodical attention he brought to every investigation. His first decision was to expand the search. The body might have been transported from London or any town along the railway line. The dismemberment might have occurred in Brighton, but it might equally have occurred elsewhere. with Brighton chosen merely as a convenient disposal point. Donaldson dispatched telegrams to police forces across the south of England. Had any young women been reported missing between the 1st and 10th of June? Had any suspicious activity been observed near railway stations or left luggage offices? Had any residents with medical or butchering skills behaved unusually during that period? The responses began arriving within hours, and with them came a deluge of information that threatened to overwhelm the investigation. Missing women were reported from Portsmouth, Southampton, London, Worthing, and a dozen other towns. Most proved false leads, women who had returned home, or eloped, or simply moved without informing their landladies, but each report required investigation, each name required verification, each claim demanded police time and attention. Donaldson assigned constables to follow up on every lead, knowing that somewhere in this mass of information might lie the single thread that would lead to identification. Meanwhile, the forensic examination continued. A specialist from the Home Office arrived to examine the wrapping materials. He determined that the brown paper was manufactured by a mill in Lancashire and distributed widely through wholesale stationers across England. The string was common hemp, again untraceable. The cotton wadding was medical grade, the type sold by chemists for wound dressing. Donaldson ordered visits to every chemist in Brighton, asking about recent purchases of wadding in quantities larger than normal domestic use. The results proved disappointing. Several people had purchased wadding in recent weeks, for legitimate medical purposes, for cleaning, for packing delicate items. None of the purchases seemed connected to murder. The trunk itself underwent minute examination. The wood showed no maker's mark, but the construction suggested manufacture within the past 5 years. The brass lock and hinges were standard fittings. The rope used to bind it was new, purchased recently, showing no weathering or wear. A specialist in luggage manufacturing was brought from London to examine the trunk. He estimated it had been manufactured in Birmingham and distributed through general stores and markets across England. Thousands of identical trunks existed. This one was completely ordinary, which was perhaps its most damning feature. The killer had chosen deliberately, nothing distinctive, nothing traceable, nothing that would draw attention at a busy railway station. As the days passed, the investigation settled into a grim routine. Every morning brought new tips from the public. A woman had been seen arguing with a man near the railway station. A doctor had been behaving strangely. A butcher had closed his shop for several days in early June. Each tip was investigated, each lead pursued, and each one dissolved into nothing. The woman arguing had been identified and was alive and well. The doctor had been attending a medical conference in Edinburgh. The butcher had been visiting his sick mother in Kent. The investigation consumed hundreds of man-hours, but the circle of knowledge did not expand. Donaldson established a headquarters at Brighton Police Station and divided his team into specialised units. One group focused on identification, compiling lists of missing women and attempting to match the physical description to known disappearances. Another group canvassed lodging houses and hotels, questioning landladies and servants about guests who had checked in during early June and never checked out. A third group investigated men with anatomical knowledge, doctors, medical students, butchers, former army surgeons. A fourth group traced the trunk's possible movements, checking railway timetables and interviewing station staff at every stop between London and Brighton. The press coverage intensified. Newspapers published artist reconstructions attempting to show what the victim might have looked like. These illustrations were necessarily speculative. Without the head, without any facial features, the artist worked only from body proportions and estimated height. The images varied wildly, some showing a refined woman of means, others depicting a working-class girl. None of them helped. No one came forward claiming to recognize the reconstructions. The victim remained anonymous, floating in a void between life and death, known only by what had been done to her body. Dr. Bainbridge conducted further examinations as the soft tissues continued to deteriorate. He took tissue samples for microscopic analysis, hoping to find evidence of poison or disease that might narrow the field of investigation. The results showed nothing unusual. The woman had been healthy. Whatever killed her had left no trace on her torso. The most likely cause of death, Bainbridge concluded, was some form of head trauma or suffocation, injuries that would have been visible on the missing head and neck but left no mark on the chest and abdomen. By the end of June, Donaldson faced a frustrating reality. Despite the intensive investigation, despite the hundreds of interviews and the thousands of hours of police work, they were no closer to solving the case than they had been on the morning of the 17th. The victim remained unidentified. The killer remained unknown. The motive remained obscure. All they had was a torso in the mortuary, wrapped in common brown paper, packed in an ordinary trunk, deposited by someone who had vanished into the anonymous crowds of a summer railway station. The seaside town continued its summer season, but the shadow of the trunk murder lay across everything. Holiday makers still came, but in smaller numbers. Some boarding houses reported cancellations. The newspapers continued to publish updates, but with each passing day, there was less to report. The investigation was stalling, not from lack of effort, but from lack of evidence. The killer had been too careful. The victim had been too thoroughly erased. And Brighton, once synonymous with pleasure and escape, had become a place where darkness lurked beneath the bright facades of the promenade. In his office late at night, Donaldson would sometimes stand at the window looking out over the sleeping town. The pier lights reflected on the black water. The sound of the sea was constant, eternal. Somewhere in this town or beyond it was a person who had killed with cold precision and hidden their work with careful planning. That person was eating meals, sleeping in a bed, perhaps even walking the same streets where Donaldson conducted his investigation. The thought was maddening. Justice required a name, an identity, a connection between the living and the dead. Without these things, there could be no arrest, no trial, no punishment. The woman in the mortuary would remain forever unnamed, and her killer forever free. Chapter 3. The Search for a Name. July arrived hot and still over Brighton. The investigation entered its third week without significant progress. Detective Chief Inspector Donaldson understood that if identification did not come soon, the case would grow cold. Bodies decomposed, memories faded, witnesses moved away or forgot details. The urgency of those first days after discovery gave way to the grinding patience required for cases that defied easy solution. But Donaldson was not ready to accept defeat. He expanded the search, reaching beyond Sussex, beyond England, into territories where a young woman might have lived and died without anyone noticing her absence. The first major appeal appeared in newspapers across Britain on the 2nd of July. It contained every physical detail the police could determine. Female, approximately 25 to 30 years of age, height estimated at 5 feet 2 inches, weight estimated at 8 stone. Well-nourished, no visible scars or birthmarks on the torso. The appeal asked anyone with information about a missing woman matching this description to contact Brighton police immediately. The telephone lines at the police station were overwhelmed within hours. Sergeant William Morris was assigned to manage the incoming tips. He established a systematic approach, creating index cards for every call and letter. Each tip received a reference number. Each one was evaluated for plausibility before being assigned to a detective for follow-up. The volume was staggering. In the first 3 days, over 200 calls came in. Women reported missing daughters, sisters, friends. Employers reported missing servants. Landladies reported missing tenants. Each report began with hope and ended with disappointment. The missing women were found alive, or had died years before, or did not match the physical description, or had never existed in the first place. Fabrications by people seeking attention, or hoping for reward money that did not exist. Among the tips came one that seemed more promising than most. a woman named Edith Drew telephoned from London on the 5th of July. She had not seen her friend Constance Clark since late May. Constance was 27 years old, approximately 5 feet 2 inches tall, slender build. She had worked as a dancer in a West End theatre, but had mentioned visiting Brighton during early June. Drew had tried to contact her throughout June without success. The telephone at Constance's lodging house rang unanswered. Letters went unreturned. Drew was worried enough to travel to London's police stations, but without evidence of foul play, they had taken her report and done nothing further. Donaldson dispatched 2 detectives to London immediately. They found Constance Clark's lodging house in Fitzrovia, a narrow building divided into small rooms rented to theatrical people and artists. The landlady remembered Constance well, a quiet girl who paid her rent on time and caused no trouble. She had last seen her on the 28th of May, when Constance had mentioned travelling to Brighton for a few days. The landlady had expected her back by the 1st of June, but Constance had never returned. Her room remained exactly as she had left it, belongings untouched, rent unpaid for 5 weeks. The detectives searched Constance's room with careful attention. They found clothes, personal letters, theatrical programmes, a small amount of money in a drawer. Nothing suggested violence or hurried departure. Constance had packed a single small case for her Brighton trip, taking only what she needed for a few days away. The letters provided names of friends and family. Each one was contacted. None had heard from Constance since late May. Her mother, living in Bristol, grew hysterical when detectives appeared at her door. She had assumed Constance was busy with theatrical work. Now she learned her daughter had been missing for over a month. Constance's description matched the trunk victim closely. Height, weight, age, build, all corresponded. Her theatrical work meant she moved frequently between London and Brighton, performing in summer shows at the Seaside theatres. She would have been familiar with Brighton railway station, comfortable travelling alone, confident in navigating the town. The timeline fit. The final confirmed sighting was May 28th. The estimated date of death was June 3rd or 4th. If Constance had travelled to Brighton on the 29th or 30th of May, stayed a few days, and been killed on the 3rd or 4th of June, everything aligned. But alignment was not proof. Without the head, without hands and feet, without any identifying features beyond general body type, Donaldson could not definitively state that the torso in Brighton mortuary belonged to Constance Clark. He needed confirmation through dental records. Constance's mother provided the name of her daughter's dentist in Bristol. The dentist searched his records and found charts documenting Constance's dental work. 2 fillings in upper molars, 1 missing lower premolar. This information should have been decisive. But without the head, without teeth, the dental records were useless. Donaldson made a decision that troubled him but seemed necessary. He would attempt facial reconstruction based on the torso's proportions, combined with photographs of Constance Clark, to see if a likeness could be established. A specialist sculptor was brought from London, an artist who had worked with police before, to reconstruct faces from partial remains. The sculptor studied the torso, measured proportions, estimated neck dimensions and head size. Then he examined photographs of Constance, studio portraits from her theatrical work, showing her in stage makeup but also in natural light. The sculptor worked for 3 days, creating a clay model that he believed represented a reasonable approximation of how the trunk victim might have looked in life. The result was displayed to Constance's friends and family. Their reactions were mixed and inconclusive. Edith Drew believed it resembled Constance but could not be certain. Constance's mother wept and said yes, then no, then yes again. A theatrical colleague thought perhaps it might be her, but the features seemed different. The reconstruction, intended to provide clarity, instead generated only more uncertainty. The human face was too complex, too individual to be reconstructed from body proportions and guesswork. The sculptor had done his best, but his best was not enough. Donaldson pursued other avenues. Constance's clothing was examined. Police visited the shops where she had purchased dresses and undergarments. The items found in her London room were compared to what might have been worn by the trunk victim. Dr. Bainbridge examined the torso again, looking for any evidence that might confirm or exclude Constance as the victim. He found nothing definitive. The body had decomposed too far. Any subtle markers that might have provided identification had been lost to decay and the very process of dismemberment. By mid-July, despite the initial promise of the Constance Clark lead, Donaldson had to admit that he could neither confirm nor exclude her as the victim. She remained missing. The trunk victim remained unidentified. The two cases existed in a frustrating parallel, possibly the same tragedy viewed from different angles, or possibly two separate mysteries that happened to intersect in timing and circumstance. Donaldson ordered that Constance's disappearance be kept in the active file, but he could not justify focusing the entire investigation on a single possibility that might be coincidental. Other potential identifications emerged and faded with similar frustration. A woman named Alice Morris had disappeared from Portsmouth in early June. Her physical description matched. Her husband had reported her missing, claiming she had left him after an argument. Detectives interviewed the husband extensively. He seemed genuinely distraught, but also evasive. His story changed in small details between tellings. Police searched his home and business premises. They found nothing suspicious. Without evidence connecting him to the trunk murder, without proof that his missing wife was the trunk victim, they could only watch him and wait. A prostitute working Brighton's waterfront district had not been seen since late May. Her name was recorded in police files as Margaret Bailey, though that may have been an alias. She matched the victim's height and build. Her occupation made her vulnerable to violence. Several constables remembered seeing her in early June, but none could pinpoint an exact date. Her disappearance had not been reported because women in her profession came and went without notice, moving between towns as circumstances dictated. Detectives attempted to trace her movements, but the trail was cold. Women like Margaret lived in the shadows, known by faces rather than names, existing in spaces that left no records. The search for identification consumed the investigation throughout July. Donaldson's team pursued every lead with equal diligence, but the absence of distinctive identifying features made the work nearly impossible. Without the head, they had no face, no dental records, no hair colour, no eye colour. Without hands and feet, they had no fingerprints, no identifying scars or marks on extremities. They had only a female torso that could have belonged to thousands of young women in England. The killer had not simply murdered, they had erased identity itself, stripping away everything that made a person recognisable, leaving only anonymous flesh that could be anyone and therefore was no one. The public's attention began to waver. The initial horror had been sustained by the expectation that identification would come quickly, that the mystery would be solved through diligent police work and modern forensic science. But as weeks passed without progress, the newspapers began to publish smaller stories, placed further from the front page. Other news competed for attention. Brighton's summer season continued. Visitors returned in larger numbers as the memory of the trunk discovery faded into background unease. Donaldson refused to let the case die through inattention. He maintained the full investigative team throughout July, pursuing every lead regardless of how tenuous. He met daily with Stacey, reviewing progress, discussing theories, searching for angles they might have missed. The evidence was reviewed repeatedly. The trunk was examined again and again. The wrapping materials were sent to multiple laboratories. The rope was analysed by specialists in cordage and naval supplies. Every physical object connected to the case was studied with minute attention, as if sheer force of scrutiny might reveal secrets that had remained hidden. But objects do not speak. They reveal only what they contain, and these objects contained nothing beyond their ordinariness. The trunk remained generic. The paper remained untraceable. The wadding remained common, and in the mortuary the torso remained nameless, a body without history, a victim without identity, a tragedy without resolution. The summer heat intensified. The morgue's preservation capabilities were limited. Dr. Bainbridge warned that soon, burial would become necessary. A body could not be kept indefinitely. Decomposition would continue. Eventually, nothing would remain but bones, and even those would need to be interred. The thought of burying the victim without a name troubled Donaldson profoundly. It seemed the final indignity, the ultimate victory for whoever had killed her. To be murdered was terrible. To be dismembered was horror. But to be buried in a pauper's grave with no name, no mourners, no recognition of the life that had been stolen, this felt like erasure more complete than death itself. Donaldson promised himself and his team that they would not give up. They would find her name. They would give her back the identity that had been taken. But as July ended and August approached, that promise seemed increasingly hollow, a gesture of defiance against an enemy who had planned too well and hidden too carefully. Chapter 4. The Second Discovery. The morning of the 10th of July brought news that transformed the investigation from a local tragedy into something larger and more disturbing. A telephone call came to Scotland Yard from the King's Cross railway station in London. Workers in the left luggage office had discovered something suspicious. A package, deposited weeks earlier and never collected, had begun to smell. The parallels to Brighton were immediately obvious. Donaldson was informed within the hour. He departed for London on the next available train, arriving at King's Cross by early afternoon. The scene was grimly familiar. King's Cross Station, like Brighton, served as a major rail terminus, crowded with travellers and commerce. The left luggage office occupied a similar position, a room where packages and cases could be left for a fee while travellers conducted their business. The suspicious item was not a trunk but a large brown paper parcel wrapped with string and labelled with a false name and address. It had been deposited on the 6th of June, 4 days before the Brighton trunk was left at Brighton station. The clerk who had accepted it remembered nothing about the depositor. The fee had been paid, the ticket issued, the parcel placed on a shelf. The package had leaked. The brown paper had developed dark stains. The smell, now that attention had been drawn to it, was unmistakable. Donaldson ordered the left luggage office cleared and sealed. A police surgeon was summoned. The package was carefully photographed before being opened. The string was cut. The paper was peeled back. Inside, wrapped in additional layers of cloth and newspaper, were human remains. Not a torso this time, but limbs. 2 legs severed at the hip, 2 feet separately wrapped, showing the same surgical precision of dismemberment that had characterized the Brighton discovery. The implication struck Donaldson immediately. These might be the missing parts of the Brighton victim. The timing fit. The Brighton trunk had been deposited on the 10th of June. This package had been left at King's Cross 4 days earlier, on the 6th. The killer might have divided the body, disposing of different parts at different locations to reduce the risk of discovery. If both trunk and package were opened, connecting them would be difficult without the head and torso together. But the killer had miscalculated. Both had been discovered. Now the question was whether they belonged to the same victim. The legs and feet were transported to London's main mortuary. Donaldson arranged for Dr. Bainbridge to travel from Brighton with photographs and measurements of the trunk torso. The comparison would need to be precise. If the legs matched the torso, it would confirm the killer had used multiple disposal sites. If they did not match, it meant something even more disturbing, that there were multiple victims, multiple dismemberments, possibly multiple killers operating with similar methods. The examination took place that evening in a tiled room lit by harsh electric lights. Bainbridge worked alongside London's chief police surgeon, Dr. Robert Bronte. a meticulous man known for his attention to anatomical detail. They measured the femoral bones at the hip joint. They compared the width of the pelvic socket to the width of the torso's remaining pelvic structure. They examined the cutting marks, looking for patterns in the blade strokes that might indicate the same hand had done both dismemberments. The work was painstaking, conducted in near silence, interrupted only by technical observations and measurements, called out for recording. After 3 hours, Bronte and Bainbridge conferred in low voices while Donaldson waited with forced patience. Finally, they delivered their conclusion. The legs could belong to the Brighton torso. The measurements were consistent. The method of dismemberment was identical. The decomposition timeline matched. However, they could not state this with absolute certainty. Human anatomy varied. Joint widths were not unique to individuals. Without soft tissue connection, without being able to physically reunite the parts, they could only say the match was possible, even probable, but not proven beyond doubt. Donaldson accepted this with the frustration of a man growing accustomed to ambiguity. Probable was not proof. Possible was not certain. But common sense suggested the obvious explanation. One victim, one killer, one crime divided between 2 locations. The investigation now spanned 2 major railway stations, 2 cities, and the line of track connecting them. Somewhere along this route, in London or Brighton or one of the towns between, a woman had been murdered and methodically dismembered. Her killer had transported the parts separately, choosing busy railway stations where a trunk or parcel would attract no attention among hundreds of similar items deposited daily. The King's Cross package was examined with the same forensic intensity that had been applied to the Brighton trunk. The brown paper came from the same Lancashire mill. The string was identical hemp. The wrapping methodology showed the same careful layering of materials designed to contain leakage and mask odour. Even the handwriting on the false address label, though brief, showed similarities to the handwriting on the Brighton trunk's deposit receipt that had been preserved in the left luggage records. Handwriting analysis was an imprecise science, but the similarities were suggestive. Similar slant, similar letter formation, similar pressure patterns. Donaldson faced a decision about how to handle this new development publicly. The newspapers had been following the Brighton case with waning interest as July progressed without breakthroughs. The King's Cross discovery would reignite that interest, bringing both benefits and problems. Public attention might generate new leads and witnesses, but it would also bring sensationalism, false tips, and pressure for quick solutions. After consulting with his superiors at Scotland Yard, Donaldson authorised a carefully worded press release. Human remains had been discovered at King's Cross Station. They might be connected to the Brighton trunk case. The investigation was ongoing. Appeals for information were renewed. The newspapers responded as he had expected. Headlines blared across London and Brighton. Second trunk horror. Killer strikes at King's Cross. Body parts found in capital. The coverage was lurid, mixing fact with speculation in ways that made Donaldson's work more difficult. Journalists besieged both King's Cross Station and Brighton Police Headquarters. They interviewed passengers, railway workers, anyone who might provide a quote. The serious newspapers attempted factual reporting. The sensational press published wild theories, ritual killers, foreign gangs, medical students gone insane. The investigation expanded to encompass the railway line itself. Donaldson ordered checks of every station between London and Brighton. Had any station staff noticed suspicious luggage or travellers during the first week of June? Had any left luggage offices received items that were quickly collected or never collected? Had anyone deposited packages and seemed nervous or unusual? The responses came slowly over the following days. Railway workers were questioned at Croydon, Redhill, Haywards Heath, and every stop between. Nothing significant emerged. The killer had blended perfectly into the flow of normal railway traffic. The timing of the 2 deposits troubled Donaldson. The King's Cross package on the 6th of June, the Brighton trunk on the 10th. Why the gap? Why two locations? Several theories emerged during investigative discussions. Perhaps the killer had dismembered the body in London, disposed of the legs at King's Cross, then transported the torso to Brighton 4 days later, hoping that distance and time would prevent connection. Or perhaps the dismemberment had occurred in Brighton, with the legs transported back to London for disposal and the torso left locally. Or perhaps the killer lived somewhere between London and Brighton, using both cities as disposal points to direct suspicion away from their actual location. Each theory had logic, but no proof. The investigation was becoming a maze of possibilities, each corridor leading to another branching path, none leading to definite answers. Donaldson maintained discipline among his team, insisting on facts over speculation, but even he felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down. They had 2 discoveries, possibly 1 victim, possibly 2, and a killer who had successfully navigated the busiest railway corridor in England while carrying human remains without arousing any suspicion whatsoever. The summer continued its hot progression. August approached. In Brighton, the memory of the trunk discovery had become part of the town's atmosphere. A dark story told in boarding houses, a thrill for visitors who wanted to see the very railway station where horror had been stored in a left luggage office. The investigation had become performance as much as process. Detectives were seen working. The public was reassured that justice was being pursued. But privately, those closest to the case understood that time was running out. Without identification, without witnesses, without physical evidence connecting to a suspect, the case was drifting toward the realm of unsolved mysteries, stories that would be told and retold but never resolved. In his temporary office at King's Cross, Donaldson reviewed files by lamplight as the station below emptied of its evening crowds. The legs and feet were now in a London mortuary. The torso remained in Brighton. The head, hands and arms were still missing, presumably destroyed or hidden so thoroughly they would never be found. He had pursued this case with every resource available. Dozens of detectives had followed hundreds of leads. Thousands of man-hours had been devoted to identification and investigation. Yet the victim remained nameless, and the killer remained free, moving through the world undetected, perhaps congratulating themselves on their success, perhaps already planning another crime, or perhaps simply returning to ordinary life, secure in the knowledge that they had committed the perfect murder. Chapter 5: A Town Under Scrutiny. Brighton in August of 1934 existed in a state of suspended tension. The summer season continued. Families still arrived on trains. Children still played on the beaches. The pier still offered their amusements. But beneath this surface of normalcy ran currents of suspicion and unease. The trunk murder had transformed the town into a place where everyone watched everyone else, where ordinary interactions carried the weight of potential revelation, where the question of identity extended beyond the victim to encompass the killer who walked unseen among the crowds. Detective Chief Inspector Donaldson established his primary headquarters at Brighton Police Station, but the true scope of the investigation radiated outward through every street and building in the town. He understood that if the murder had been committed in Brighton, then evidence existed somewhere within the town's boundaries. A woman had died. Her body had been dismembered. The work would have required privacy, time, and facilities. A room where blood could be spilled and cleaned, tools for cutting, containers for disposing of waste. Such activities left traces. The challenge was finding them among thousands of residences, hundreds of commercial premises, and countless temporary visitors who had come and gone during the critical period. The investigation of lodging houses began systematically. Brighton in summer hosted thousands of visitors who stayed in boarding houses ranging from respectable establishments on the better streets to cramped rooms in the less fashionable quarters near the railway goods yards. Each lodging house maintained a register of guests as required by law. Detectives began visiting these establishments, examining registers for the period from late May through mid-June. looking for irregularities, unexplained departures, or guests whose behaviour had seemed unusual. The landladies of Brighton proved to be formidable sources of information, though their reliability varied considerably. Mrs. Agnes Miller, who kept a respectable house on Weston Road, remembered a young woman who had checked in on the 1st of June and left suddenly on the 4th without explanation or forwarding address. The description was vague: dark hair, medium height, well-dressed. Detectives investigated thoroughly. The woman's signature in the register was traced through other hotels. She was found living in London, employed as a governess, completely alive and bewildered by police interest in her brief Brighton holiday. Mrs. Dorothy Hawkins operated a less genteel establishment near the station. She reported that one of her regular male guests had brought a woman to his room on the evening of June 3rd. This violated house rules. Mrs. Hawkins had confronted the guest the following morning. He had paid for the extra occupancy and the woman had left shortly afterward. Detectives located the guest, a commercial traveller from Manchester. He confirmed the story with embarrassment. The woman was a prostitute he had engaged for the evening. She had left alive and been paid. He did not know her name. Attempts to locate her through Brighton's street workers produced no results. Each lodging house investigation followed similar patterns, initial promise dissolving into disappointment. The problem was the sheer volume of temporary residents. Brighton during summer was a transient place. People came for a day, a week, a fortnight. They left no permanent traces. Landladies remembered faces imperfectly. Registers contained false names and addresses. The anonymity that made Brighton attractive to holidaymakers also made it ideal for someone wishing to commit murder without detection. Hotels received equal scrutiny. The Grand Hotel, Brighton's most prestigious establishment, opened its records to police inspection. Detective Sergeant James Thornton spent 3 days reviewing June registrations. Every guest was accounted for. Every departure was explained. The hotel staff were interviewed extensively. Nothing suspicious emerged. The same process was repeated at the Metropole, the Norfolk, and dozens of smaller hotels throughout the town. The work was tedious and exhaustive, consuming weeks of investigative time and producing no meaningful leads. Donaldson expanded the search to include any premises that might have provided the privacy necessary for dismemberment. Butcher shops were visited. The owners were questioned about their premises, their tools, their movements during early June. Most were cooperative, understanding the necessity of the investigation. A few resented the implication. One butcher on North Street became belligerent when detectives asked to inspect his cutting room, shouting about police harassment and threatening complaints to his Member of Parliament. His anger made him briefly suspect. A thorough investigation of his background and activities during the relevant period revealed nothing beyond a quick temper and a legitimate business. Medical facilities came under scrutiny. Brighton had several hospitals, numerous doctors' offices, and a medical school affiliated with the University of Sussex. Anyone with access to these facilities potentially had both the anatomical knowledge and the tools necessary for dismemberment. Hospital administrators were approached delicately. Donaldson understood the sensitivity of suggesting that a medical professional might be involved in murder. The investigations were conducted quietly. Staff rosters were reviewed. Doctors and surgeons who had been on duty during early June were interviewed. Surgical instruments were inventoried. Operating theatres were inspected for any signs of unauthorised use. Dr. Graham Mitchell, a surgeon at Brighton General Hospital, became a brief focus of investigation. He had taken several days of leave in early June, citing personal matters. He lived alone in rooms near the hospital. He fit the profile of someone with surgical skill and access to medical facilities. Detectives interviewed him with careful formality. Mitchell was cooperative but clearly offended by the implication. He provided detailed accounts of his whereabouts during his leave. He had visited his sister in Bath, a fact confirmed by both the sister and the hotel where he had stayed. His reputation among colleagues was impeccable. The investigation of Mitchell concluded with apologies. and the uncomfortable awareness that many innocent people would be touched by suspicion before this case reached resolution, the waterfront district received particular attention. This was Brighton's rougher quarter, where sailors, dock workers, and those who served them created a world separate from the respectable boarding houses and family hotels of the town centre. Here, women worked the streets openly, men drank in pubs that stayed open past legal hours, and violence was common enough to rarely warrant police attention unless it resulted in serious injury. Donaldson understood that a woman could disappear from this district with less notice than from more respectable areas. Constable Edward Price knew the waterfront intimately. He had walked its streets for 15 years, establishing relationships with the pub owners, the women who worked there, and even some of the criminals who operated in the shadows. Donaldson assigned him to investigate whether any of the district's women had gone missing during the critical period. Price approached the task with the delicacy required. The women of the waterfront had reasons to distrust police. Many had been arrested for solicitation. Most used false names. Their movements were fluid. They might work Brighton for a few weeks, then move to Portsmouth or Southampton or London, following opportunity and avoiding arrest warrants. Price compiled a list of women who had been regularly seen in the district during May, but had not been observed since early June. The list contained 11 names, most certainly aliases. He began the painstaking work of tracing each one. 3 were found working in Portsmouth. 2 had been arrested in London on unrelated charges. 1 had returned to her family in Wales. 4 could not be located. These 4 became subjects of intensive investigation. Descriptions were circulated. Known associates were interviewed. The information gathered was frustratingly vague. The women existed in the margins, leaving few records, remembered by physical description rather than name. One of the 4 missing women matched the trunk victim's description closely. She had been known in the waterfront pubs as Kitty, though this was certainly not her real name. She had been in her mid-20s, approximately 5 feet 2 inches tall, dark-haired, slender. She had been seen regularly through late May. Several pub workers remembered her drinking with a man on the evening of June 3rd, but descriptions of the man varied wildly. Tall or medium height, dark or fair hair, well-dressed or shabby. Kitty had left the pub with this man around 10 o'clock. She had not been seen since. Donaldson authorised intensive efforts to identify Kitty and trace her movements. Detectives returned to the waterfront night after night, showing the sculptured reconstruction to anyone who might have known her. Some thought they recognised the face, others were certain it was not her. The inherent unreliability of the reconstruction made definitive identification impossible. Without a real name, without family or legitimate employment records, Kitty remained as anonymous as the torso in the mortuary. She might have been the victim. She might simply have moved to another town. The uncertainty was maddening. The investigation of Brighton's physical spaces extended to unusual locations. Warehouses near the railway goods yards were searched. Storage facilities were inspected. Abandoned buildings were examined. Detectives looked for signs of recent occupancy, bloodstains, discarded tools, anything that might indicate where the dismemberment had occurred. The summer heat made this work physically demanding. Men searched dusty attics, damp cellars, and cramped storage rooms in temperatures that reached into the high 70s. One promising discovery came from an empty shop on a side street near the station. The premises had been vacant since March, awaiting a new tenant. A constable checking the building found a broken window at the rear, and signs that someone had been inside recently. The floors showed scuff marks. A corner of the back room had water stains that might have been from cleaning. The landlord was contacted. He confirmed the window had been intact when he last inspected the property in early May. Forensic specialists were brought to examine the premises. They found no blood traces, no discarded tools, no definitive evidence of criminal activity. The water stains proved to be from a leaking roof. The break-in had probably been vagrant children seeking shelter. Another lead dissolved into nothing. As August progressed, the investigation's intensity began to wane, not from lack of commitment, but from exhaustion of possibilities. Every lodging house had been visited, every hotel had been checked, every business with potential connection to dismemberment had been investigated. Thousands of people had been interviewed. The physical search of Brighton had been as thorough as police resources allowed, yet the circle of knowledge had not closed. The killer remained unidentified. The victim remained unnamed. The location of the crime remained unknown. The town itself began to adapt to the presence of unsolved horror. The initial shock faded into something more complicated, a mixture of fascination, fear, and gradual acceptance that this mystery might never be resolved. Tour guides began including the railway station on their routes, pointing out the left luggage office where the trunk had waited. Some landladies mentioned the case to their guests as a sort of macabre attraction. Brighton was learning to incorporate its darkness into its identity, the way cities had always done when confronted with crimes that defied solution. Donaldson felt the weight of this transformation personally. He had devoted months to this investigation, pursuing every lead with methodical determination. His team had worked with dedication beyond what duty required, yet they had failed to achieve the basic requirement of any murder investigation: identifying the victim. Without a name, without identity, the woman in the mortuary remained less than human in the eyes of the law, a body rather than a person, evidence of a crime rather than the central tragedy of a stolen life. In the quiet of his temporary office, late on an August evening with the sound of the sea drifting through open windows, Donaldson confronted the possibility that this case might join the ranks of famous unsolved murders, crimes that became part of public mythology precisely because they were never explained. Jack the Ripper, the Thames Torso murders, Wallace's killing. These cases lived in memory not despite their mystery but because of it. The Brighton trunk murder was taking its place among them, a story that would be told and retold, theorized and debated, but never definitively resolved. The town slept beneath summer stars. Somewhere within it, or beyond it, was a person who had killed with careful planning and hidden their work with skill that bordered on genius. That person was perhaps sleeping peacefully, secure in the knowledge that their crime had been perfect. Or perhaps they lay awake, wondering when the knock on the door would come, when the circle would finally close. Donaldson preferred to believe the latter. He needed to believe that the killer feared discovery, that justice was only delayed rather than defeated. But as August ended and September approached, that belief became harder to maintain. The trunk murder was becoming history rather than investigation, memory rather than active case, and with that transformation came the bitter understanding that some crimes outlast the pursuit of justice. Chapter 6. The Dancer from Park Crescent. September brought cooler weather to Brighton and a shift in the investigation's focus. While Donaldson continued pursuing leads related to the trunk murder, a separate case emerged that would become forever entangled with the first in public memory, despite being entirely distinct in origin and circumstances. This new case began not with a discovery at a railway station, but with the routine inquiries that police made into the lives of Brighton's more transient residents. Violette Kay had lived in Brighton for nearly 2 years before her disappearance drew police attention. She was 42 years old, though she claimed to be 36 in the theatrical listings, where she advertised herself as a dancer and entertainer. Her real name was Violet Saunders, but she had adopted the more exotic stage name years before, when she had worked in London's music halls. By the time she reached Brighton, her dancing career had declined into work of a different nature. She performed occasionally in the smaller seafront venues, but increasingly her income came from the company of men who paid for more than entertainment. She lived in a basement flat at 44 Park Crescent, a curved terrace of once elegant houses that had descended into multiple occupancy. The flat consisted of 2 rooms and a small kitchen, accessed by steps leading down from street level. It was damp and poorly lit, but the rent was affordable, and the landlord did not ask questions about visitors or the hours she kept. Violette had decorated the rooms with theatre posters and cheap drapery in an attempt to maintain the illusion of glamour. Neighbours heard music from her flat at odd hours. She owned a gramophone and played records from the music hall performances of her younger years. Her companion was a man named Tony Mancini, though this too was an assumed name. He had been born Cecil Lois, England in London in 1908, the son of a street performer and a barmaid. He had adopted his Italian-sounding stage name when he worked briefly as a singer and dancer in travelling variety shows. By 1934, at age 26, he was working as a waiter in various Brighton restaurants and cafes, moving between establishments when he was fired for petty theft or simply failed to appear for work. He had met Violette in May of that year at the Skylark Cafe where he worked. She had been immediately attracted to his dark good looks and theatrical manner. He had been attracted to her stability. She had rooms, regular income, and needed someone to help with expenses. They had established a complicated relationship that neighbours would later describe to police with varying degrees of sympathy and disapproval. Violette drank heavily. Mancini gambled and stole. They argued frequently, their raised voices carrying through the thin walls of Park Crescent. Yet they also displayed affection, walking arm in arm along the seafront, sharing meals at the cheap restaurants where Mancini had once worked. The relationship combined genuine attachment with mutual exploitation in ways that were common among Brighton's marginalised population. The last confirmed sighting of Violette K occurred on the 10th of May 1934. She had been seen by several neighbours that day, wearing a blue dress and carrying a shopping bag. She had exchanged pleasantries with Mrs. Sarah Attrill, who lived in the flat above. That evening music had played from Violette's flat until late. The gramophone records she favoured, scratchy recordings of music hall songs. After that night, Violette was neither seen nor heard. Her flat went silent. The music stopped. The comings and goings that had characterised her residence ceased entirely. Mancini explained her absence to anyone who asked. Violette had gone to Paris, he said, to visit friends from her theatrical days. She had left suddenly, an unexpected opportunity for work. She would return in a few weeks. The explanation seemed plausible enough that neighbours accepted it without question. Women like Violette came and went. Their lives were unpredictable. A sudden trip to Paris fit with the theatrical persona she cultivated. But as May became June and June became July, Violette's continued absence began to seem unusual. Mrs. Attrill noticed that mail was accumulating in the box for the basement flat. The rent, usually paid promptly, fell into arrears. Mancini had moved out of Park Crescent in mid-May, taking rooms at various addresses throughout Brighton. When Mrs. Attrill encountered him on the street in late July and asked about Violette, his explanation had changed. Violette had stayed in Paris, he said. She had found steady work and would not be returning to Brighton. He was forwarding her mail. Mrs. Attrill found this story less convincing. She mentioned her concerns to other neighbours. Speculation began to circulate through Park Crescent. Where exactly was Violette? Why had she left so suddenly without telling anyone? Why had Mancini moved out immediately after her departure? The questions multiplied but remained within the realm of neighbourhood gossip until the Brighton trunk murder focused public attention on missing women. In August, as police canvassed Brighton seeking information about any woman who had disappeared during the relevant period, several residents of Park Crescent mentioned Violette K. She had vanished in mid-May. She had not been seen for months. Her companion had given contradictory explanations for her absence. Detective Sergeant Thornton added Violette's name to the growing list of missing women and began routine inquiries. He visited Park Crescent on the 28th of August and spoke with Mrs. Attrill and other neighbours. Their descriptions of Violette did not match the trunk victim. She was older, taller, heavier. Nevertheless, procedure required that her disappearance be investigated. Thornton located Mancini working at the Skylark Cafe. The interview began casually, conducted in a rear room of the cafe during a quiet afternoon hour. Mancini was cooperative, even charming. He confirmed that Violette had gone to Paris in May. Yes, she had left suddenly, but that was typical of theatrical people. They followed opportunities. He missed her, certainly, but he understood. She'd written to him once, he said, though he had not kept the letter. She was well and working steadily. He expected she would return eventually, or perhaps she would stay in France. These things were impossible to predict. Thornton noted the smooth delivery of this narrative. Mancini spoke with the practiced ease of someone who had told the story multiple times and refined it with each telling. Yet small inconsistencies emerged under gentle questioning. The date of Violette's departure shifted slightly between tellings. The details of the Paris opportunity became vague when pressed. Mancini could not remember the name of the venue where she was supposedly working. These were not definitive indicators of deception. Memory was unreliable, details faded, but they created enough doubt that Thornton decided to investigate further. He returned to Park Crescent and convinced the landlord to allow access to Violette's basement flat. The rooms had been locked since mid-May. The landlord explained that Mancini had paid a month's rent in advance before leaving, claiming he was holding the flat for Violette's return. That month had expired in June, but the landlord had not yet cleared the premises or sought a new tenant. He was a man who avoided confrontation and had simply allowed the situation to continue unresolved. The basement flat was opened on the 2nd of September. The air inside was stale and close, carrying the musty smell of rooms that had been sealed through summer heat. Thornton entered with a constable and the landlord. The scene that met them was one of frozen domesticity. Dishes remained in the kitchen sink unwashed since May. The bed was unmade, sheets rumpled as if someone had just risen. Clothes hung in the wardrobe. The gramophone sat on a table with a record still on the turntable. Everything suggested sudden departure, a life interrupted mid-moment. Thornton began a systematic search. He examined the wardrobe, noting that most of Violette's theatrical costumes and better dresses remained. If she had gone to Paris for work, she would surely have taken these items. The gramophone records were her prized possessions, yet they remained. Personal items, makeup, jewellery, photographs were all present. The more Thornton searched, the less the Paris story made sense. This was not the room of someone who had left by choice. This was the room of someone who had left nothing behind because she had never left at all. The search moved to less obvious spaces. Thornton examined the cupboards, the space beneath the sink, the area under the bed. In a closet in the bedroom, partially hidden by hanging clothes, he found a large trunk, a cheap canvas case bound with leather straps. It was pushed against the back wall of the closet, not particularly well hidden, but not immediately visible. Thornton approached it with growing unease. After the Brighton trunk murder, any large container in the residence of a missing woman carried ominous implications. The trunk was heavy. Thornton could feel that before attempting to move it. He pulled it from the closet with the constable's assistance. The leather straps were secured but not locked. He unbuckled them with steady hands, though his heart was beating faster. The lid was stiff but opened with pressure. The smell emerged immediately. Not the overwhelming corruption of the railway trunk, but something equally unmistakable. Decomposition. Death. The preserved evidence of violence. Inside the trunk, wrapped in fabric and partially decomposed, was the body of a woman. She was intact. Head, limbs, torso all present. But she had been dead for months. The features were recognizable despite decay. She was older than the railway trunk victim, Fuller figured, with greying hair. Thornton did not need confirmation to know this was Violette Kay. Her body had been here since May, locked in a trunk in her own flat, while Mancini had told his stories about Paris and forwarded mail that never came. The landlord, who had followed them into the room, made a sound of horror and retreated to the hallway. The constable stood frozen, staring at the contents of the trunk. Thornton closed the lid gently, as if the gesture might offer some dignity to the woman who had been stored like unwanted luggage in her own home. He went to the nearest telephone and called Detective Chief Inspector Donaldson. There had been another trunk discovery, he reported, but this one was different. This one had a name. This one had a suspect. Chapter 7. The Waiter's Confession. The basement flat at 44 Park Crescent was transformed into a crime scene within hours of the discovery. Police cordoned off the area. Dr. Bainbridge was summoned from his office. Photographers documented the scene before the trunk was moved. The body of Violette K was transported to the mortuary with more care than had been afforded her in death. The investigation of her murder began with advantages the trunk murder had never possessed. A known victim, a clear suspect, and a crime scene that had been preserved, however accidentally, for 4 months. Detective Chief Inspector Donaldson arrived at Park Crescent as evening fell. He had been pursuing leads in the trunk murder when Thornton's call came through. The discovery of a second body in a trunk, even one clearly unrelated to the railway station case, created complications. The public would inevitably connect them. Newspapers would sensationalize the parallels. The careful distinctions between two separate crimes would be lost in headlines about Brighton's trunk murders. But these concerns were secondary to the immediate task. A woman had been killed and hidden. The man who had hidden her was still at large. Mancini had not been seen since Thornton's interview at the Skylark Cafe. A watch was placed on his known addresses. Police visited the lodging houses where he had stayed in recent months. He was not at any of them. Descriptions were circulated to constables throughout Brighton. Mancini was approximately 5 feet 9 inches tall, dark hair slicked back with pomade, clean-shaven, usually well-dressed despite limited means. He was known to frequent certain pubs and cafes. He had friends in Brighton's theatrical community. Someone would have seen him. The search intensified through the evening. Detectives visited the Skylark Cafe again. Mancini had left shortly after the earlier interview, telling the owner he felt unwell and needed to go home. He had not returned. His few possessions had been collected from his most recent lodging on Edward Street, a bedsit he had occupied for 2 weeks. The landlady reported he had packed a small case and left without explanation around 6 o'clock that evening. He had paid through the end of the week, unusual for someone who typically fell behind on rent. Donaldson considered the implications. Mancini had been interviewed in the afternoon. By evening he had fled. The timing suggested he knew or suspected that Violette's body would be discovered. Perhaps Thornton's questions had alarmed him. Perhaps he had always known this day would come and had prepared for it. Either way, he was now a fugitive, and every hour he remained free increased the chance he would disappear entirely. A description was sent to police forces throughout England. Railway stations were watched. Ports were notified. Mancini's photograph, obtained from a theatrical agency where he had once registered, was distributed. The image showed a young man with matinee idol looks. Dark eyes, symmetrical features, a slight smile suggesting confidence. It was not the face one associated with murder, but Donaldson had learned long ago that killers looked like everyone else. The post-mortem examination of Violette K provided the facts that would eventually form the foundation of a prosecution. Dr. Bainbridge conducted the examination on the morning of September 3rd. The body had been dead approximately 16 weeks. Placing death in mid-May as neighbours had reported. The cause of death was a fractured skull, a heavy blow to the head that had shattered the temporal bone and caused massive internal bleeding. The injury was consistent with a fall or a deliberate strike with a blunt object. There were no defensive wounds on the hands or arms, suggesting the blow had come without warning or that Violette had been incapacitated quickly. The position of the body in the trunk indicated she had been placed there shortly after death, while rigor mortis had not yet set in. She was clothed in the blue dress neighbours had seen her wearing on May 10th. Her personal items, rings, a necklace, remained on the body. There was no evidence of sexual assault. The violence appeared to have been a single blow, either delivered in rage or accident, followed by the panicked decision to hide the evidence rather than report it or seek help. The basement flat yielded additional evidence. The kitchen contained bloodstains on the floor near the table, partially cleaned but still visible under forensic examination. The stains matched Violette's blood type. Broken glass fragments found beneath the sink suggested a bottle or glass had been shattered during whatever altercation had preceded her death. These fragments cut a picture of the crime's likely progression, an argument, perhaps fueled by alcohol, escalating to violence. A blow struck or a push given, Violette falling, her head striking the edge of the table or the hard floor, death coming quickly. Mancini, confronted with a body and the certainty of being blamed, making the choice to hide rather than confess. The evidence against Mancini accumulated through witness testimony. Mrs. Attrill remembered that on the evening of the May 10th, she had heard raised voices from the basement flat. The words were not clear, but the tone was angry. Violette's voice shrill with emotion, a man's voice, presumably Mancini's, loud and defensive. Then silence. Then, after perhaps an hour, the sound of movement, of something heavy being dragged across the floor. Mrs. Attrill had thought nothing of it at the time. Furniture was often moved. But now, with the discovery of the trunk, the sounds took on new significance. Other neighbours contributed pieces to the emerging narrative. A man living on Park Crescent had seen Mancini leaving the building late on the night of May 10th, carrying a small suitcase. He had seemed hurried, walking quickly toward the town centre. He had not returned that night or the following day. When he did appear again at Park Crescent, it was only briefly to collect more of his belongings and inform Mrs. Attrill that Violette had gone to Paris. The landlord provided information about the trunk itself. It had been in the flat when Violette moved in 2 years earlier. She had used it for storage, keeping old costumes and theatrical memorabilia inside. Mancini would have known of its existence and location. The decision to use it as a temporary coffin suggested panicked thinking rather than careful planning. He had hidden the body in the most convenient receptacle, then fled the flat, returning only to create the fiction of Violette's departure. While the investigation of the crime scene proceeded, the search for Mancini continued. On the morning of September 4th, a tip came from Lewes, a town 10 miles northeast of Brighton. A man matching Mancini's description had been seen at the railway station, purchasing a ticket to London. Police at Victoria Station were alerted. By afternoon, Mancini was spotted on platform 17, apparently waiting for a connection. He was arrested without resistance by 2 plainclothes detectives who'd been watching the platforms. He seemed almost relieved, as if the burden of flight had become greater than the fear of capture. Mancini was transported back to Brighton and taken directly to the police station. He was formally charged with the murder of Violette Kay. The interview that followed, conducted by Donaldson with Detective Inspector Stacey present, provided the confession that would seal the case, though the truth it revealed was more complicated than a simple admission of guilt. Mancini sat in the interview room with the defeated posture of someone who had accepted inevitability. He was still well-groomed despite his flight, hair slicked back, collar neat. He asked for tea and was provided with it. Then he began to talk, not with the defiance or denial that often characterized such interviews, but with a weary matter-of-factness that suggested he had been rehearsing this narrative during his months of deception. Yes, Violette was dead. Yes, he had hidden her body. But he had not murdered her. The death had been an accident, he insisted. A terrible misfortune compounded by panic and poor decisions. On the evening of May 10th, they had argued. The argument had been about money. Violette had discovered that Mancini had been taking coins from her purse. She had accused him of theft. He had denied it. The argument had escalated, voices raised, accusations shouted. Violette had been drinking. She'd been unsteady on her feet. During the argument, she had lunged at him, trying to strike him. He had pushed her away, not hard, just enough to keep distance between them. She had stumbled backward, lost her balance, fallen. Her head had struck the edge of the kitchen table. Mancini claimed he had tried to help her. He had knelt beside her, attempted to rouse her, but she had not responded. Blood had pooled beneath her head. Her eyes had remained fixed and empty. He had realized she was dead, and in that moment he had made the decision that would define everything that followed. He had not called for help. He had not reported the accident. Instead, he had panicked. He feared being blamed. He feared the police would not believe his account. He feared the gallows. So he had hidden her. He had wrapped her in fabric. He had placed her in the trunk. He had cleaned the blood as best he could. Then he had left the flat, returning only to create the story about Paris and collect his belongings. He had lived with the knowledge of what lay in that basement room for 4 months, knowing that discovery might come at any moment, yet hoping somehow that it never would. Donaldson listened to this account with the skepticism born of long experience. The line between accident and murder was often drawn by the person claiming innocence. A push could be deliberate. A blow could be intentional. The disposal of a body suggested consciousness of guilt that extended beyond panic over an accident. Nevertheless, Mancini's story would need to be tested against evidence. That would be the work of prosecutors and defense lawyers, and ultimately a jury. For now, Donaldson had achieved what the trunk murder had never allowed. A suspect in custody, a case prepared for trial, the machinery of justice set in motion. The news of Mancini's arrest reached the newspapers by evening. Headlines proclaimed the solution to Brighton's trunk mystery, conveniently ignoring that there were 2 trunk cases and only one had been solved. The public, hungry for resolution after months of speculation, embraced the narrative enthusiastically. Tony Mancini became the face of evil, the foreign-sounding name and theatrical background fitting perfectly with preconceptions about criminality. The distinction between the unsolved railway trunk murder and the solved Park Crescent case was lost in the general relief that someone had been caught. In his cell, Mancini sat quietly as night fell over Brighton. He had told his version of events. Whether anyone would believe it remained to be seen. The trial would determine his fate, the gallows or freedom, judgment or mercy. He had chosen to hide a body rather than report a death, and that choice had set him on a path that led inexorably to this cell, to these charges, to the prospect of standing before a court and explaining why a woman had died and why he had treated her remains with such callous disregard. Across town, in the mortuary, 2 bodies lay in cold storage. One was Violette Kay, finally given a name and dignity in death, awaiting burial once the legal process had concluded. The other was the torso from the railway station, still nameless, still unidentified, still representing a mystery that had consumed months of investigation without resolution. The 2 women, connected only by the manner of their concealment, represented the dual nature of Brighton in that summer of 1934, a town where some secrets were revealed and others remained forever hidden in shadow. Chapter 8. The Trial of Mancini. The trial of Tony Mancini opened at Lewes Assizes on the 10th of December, 1934. The ancient courthouse, with its stone walls and oak-panelled chambers, had witnessed centuries of English justice dispensed under the weight of law and precedent. Now it would hear a case that had captured the imagination of a nation, not because of the crime's complexity, but because of its entanglement with the more sinister mystery that remained unsolved. The public gallery filled hours before proceedings began. Newspaper reporters occupied every available seat. Outside, crowds gathered in the cold December air, hoping for glimpses of the defendant or updates on testimony. Mancini was led into the dock shortly after 10 o'clock. He wore a dark suit provided by his defense counsel, his hair neatly trimmed, his face pale but composed. He looked younger than his 26 years, almost boyish. And this quality would become central to the defense strategy that would unfold over the following days. The judge, Mr. Justice Branson, took his seat with the grave formality that such proceedings demanded. The jury was sworn. 12 men drawn from Sussex, ordinary citizens tasked with determining whether the young man before them was a murderer or the victim of tragic circumstance. The prosecution case was presented by Mr. J.D. Castles, King's Counsel, a barrister known for his methodical approach an ability to construct narratives from forensic evidence. His opening statement laid out the facts with devastating clarity. Violette K had died on the 10th of May from a fractured skull. Her body had been hidden in a trunk in her own flat. The defendant had lived with this concealed corpse for days before fleeing. He had then spent months creating elaborate lies about her whereabouts, telling neighbours and friends that she had gone to Paris when he knew she lay dead in a basement room. These were not the actions of an innocent man who had witnessed an accident. These were the actions of a murderer attempting to evade justice. The evidence was presented systematically. Dr. Bainbridge testified about the post-mortem examination, describing the skull fracture and the force required to produce such an injury. The blow, he stated with medical precision, would have required significant impact, either a fall from height or a deliberate strike with a heavy object. The prosecution suggested the latter. A woman arguing with a man might stumble and fall, but the nature of the injury suggested something more violent, more intentional. Mrs. Attrill took the witness stand and recounted what she'd heard on the evening of May 10th. The raised voices, the sound of argument, then silence, then the heavy dragging sound that she now understood had been Mancini moving Violette's body to the trunk. Her testimony was delivered with the nervous precision of someone unaccustomed to public speaking, but determined to tell the truth. Under cross-examination, she admitted that she had not heard the actual moment of death, had not witnessed any violence, had only heard sounds that could be interpreted in various ways. The landlord testified about the trunk, about Mancini's hasty departure, about the payments made to hold the flat. Other neighbours contributed pieces. The sighting of Mancini leaving late on May 10th, his subsequent returns to collect belongings, his stories about Paris that had grown more detailed and less convincing with each telling. The prosecution was building a picture of calculated deception, of a man who had time to plan, time to create false narratives, time to clean blood from floors while his victim lay wrapped in fabric mere feet away. The bloodstains found in the kitchen were presented as evidence through police testimony and photographs. The pattern suggested violence in that space, struggle or impact that had left traces despite cleaning attempts. Forensic experts confirmed the blood matched Violette's type. The broken glass fragments supported a scenario of domestic violence, bottles thrown or smashed during argument, escalating to physical confrontation. But it was Mancini's own statements to police that formed the prosecution's most damaging evidence. His lies about Paris were documented meticulously. Each version of the story was recounted, showing how details shifted and contradictions emerged under questioning. Then came the confession, or what passed for confession. His admission that Violette was dead, that he had hidden her body, that he had fled when discovery seemed imminent. The prosecution argued that this pattern of deception revealed consciousness of guilt extending far beyond panic over an accident. The defence case, presented by Mr. Norman Burkett, one of England's most skilled barristers, took a different approach entirely. Burkett understood that the facts of concealment were incontrovertible. Mancini had hidden a body. He had lied about it. These things could not be denied. But the question before the jury was not whether Mancini had behaved badly after Violette's death, but whether he had caused that death through criminal action. And here, Burkett argued, the prosecution had failed to prove its case beyond reasonable doubt. Burkett called no witnesses initially, instead focusing his energy on dismantling the prosecution's narrative through cross-examination. When Dr. Bainbridge returned to the stand, Burkett questioned him closely about the skull fracture. Could such an injury result from a fall? Yes, the doctor admitted, if the head struck a hard surface with sufficient force. Could the kitchen table edge produce such an injury? Possibly, yes. Could stumbling backward while intoxicated result in a fall violent enough to cause death? It was within the realm of possibility. The defence narrative emerged through these careful questions. Violette K was a woman who drank heavily. Witnesses had seen her intoxicated on numerous occasions. She was unsteady on her feet even when sober. On the night of her death, she'd been drinking. An argument had occurred. This was not disputed. During that argument, in her impaired state, she had fallen. The fall had been tragically fatal. Mancini, faced with a dead woman and a history that made him immediately suspect, a young man of foreign name, living off a woman's earnings, known to police for petty theft, had panicked. His decision to hide the body was morally reprehensible, but understandable given his circumstances and fear of unjust accusation. Burkett then made the decision that would prove crucial to the trial's outcome. He called Mancini to testify in his own defence. This was a calculated risk. Putting a defendant on the stand exposed him to aggressive cross-examination. But Burkett believed that the jury needed to hear directly from Mancini, to see him as a human being rather than the monster the prosecution had portrayed. Mancini took the stand on the afternoon of the third day. He spoke with surprising eloquence, his theatrical training evident in his clear diction and ability to project emotion without seeming artificial. He told his story exactly as he had told it to police, but with additional details that painted a more sympathetic picture. He described his relationship with Violette, how she had been kind to him when he was destitute, how she had offered him shelter, how he had cared for her despite her drinking and difficult moods. The argument on May 10th had been about money, yes, but also about his desire to leave, to find legitimate work, to escape the life they were living. She had not wanted him to go. She had become angry, then physical. The moment of death, as Mancini described it, had happened so quickly that he had barely comprehended it. One moment Violette was shouting and lunging at him. The next she was on the floor, blood spreading beneath her head, eyes vacant. He had knelt beside her, tried to wake her, realised the terrible finality of what had occurred, and then fear had overwhelmed him. Not fear for himself, he insisted, but fear of injustice. He knew how he would look to authorities, a young man with a criminal record living with an older woman present when she died. Who would believe it was an accident? Who would give him the benefit of doubt? Under cross-examination, Cassels attacked this narrative with precision. Why had Mancini not called for help immediately? Why had he cleaned the blood? Why had he created the Paris story? Why had he fled when police began asking questions? Each question was designed to expose the calculations behind Mancini's actions, to show that his behaviour revealed not panic, but guilty knowledge. Mancini answered as best he could, sometimes faltering, sometimes growing emotional, but maintaining throughout that he had not intended Violette's death, had not struck her deliberately, had only been guilty of cowardice in the aftermath. The defence presented character witnesses, people who had known Mancini and spoke to his generally peaceful nature. A restaurant owner testified that Mancini had never shown violence during his employment. A landlady stated he had been a quiet tenant who caused no trouble. These testimonies were brief and perhaps not particularly compelling, but they served to humanise the defendant, to suggest he was not the cold-blooded killer the prosecution portrayed. Burkett's closing argument was a masterpiece of advocacy that would be studied in law schools for decades afterward. He did not dispute the facts of concealment. He admitted freely that Mancini had behaved deplorably after Violette's death. But he asked the jury to separate moral failure from criminal guilt. The question was not whether Mancini was a good man. Clearly his actions after May 10th showed serious character flaws. The question was whether the prosecution had proven beyond reasonable doubt that he had murdered Violette K. And here, Burkett argued, the evidence failed. There were no witnesses to the actual moment of death. The medical evidence was consistent with both accident and deliberate violence. The prosecution had built its case on inference and circumstantial detail, asking the jury to conclude that because Mancini had lied afterward, he must have killed deliberately. But this logic was flawed. An innocent man, terrified of false accusation, might behave exactly as Mancini had behaved. Fear made people do terrible things. Panic overrode judgment. The decision to hide rather than report was wrong, but it was not proof of murder. Burkett's voice dropped to a near whisper as he reached his conclusion, forcing the jury to lean forward to hear. He spoke of reasonable doubt, of the sacred principle that required absolute certainty before taking a man's life. If they had any doubt, any possibility, however small, that Violette's death had been accidental, then they must acquit. To convict without certainty was to commit judicial murder, to make themselves killers in the name of justice. The prosecution's closing argument was shorter, but no less powerful. Cassels reminded the jury that Mancini had lied consistently and elaborately. He had lived with a corpse in a trunk. He had cleaned blood from floors. He had fled when questioned. These were not the actions of an innocent man overwhelmed by accident. These were the actions of someone who knew exactly what he had done and was desperate to avoid consequences. The injury to Violette's skull was severe, requiring significant force. The jury should not allow themselves to be swayed by theatrical performance in the witness box. They should focus on facts, on evidence, on the pattern of behaviour that revealed guilt. Judge Branson's summing up lasted nearly 2 hours. He reviewed the evidence methodically, explaining points of law, defining reasonable doubt, reminding the jury of their solemn duty. He was scrupulously fair, presenting both prosecution and defence arguments without obvious bias. But he also made clear that if they believed Mancini had killed Violette deliberately, they must convict regardless of sympathy they might feel for his circumstances. The jury retired late on the afternoon of December the 14th. The courtroom waited in tense silence. Spectators remained in their seats. Reporters prepared their copy. Mancini was taken to a holding cell beneath the courthouse. Hours passed. Darkness fell over Lewis. The jury sent out for dinner, indicating extended deliberations. This was generally considered favourable to the defence. Quick verdicts usually meant conviction. At 9:45 in the evening, word came that the jury had reached a verdict. The courtroom reassembled. Mancini was brought back to the dock, his face drawn with exhaustion and fear. The jury filed in, their expressions revealing nothing. The foreman stood when asked for the verdict. His voice was steady as he spoke the single word that would determine whether Mancini lived or died. Not guilty. The courtroom erupted. Some spectators cheered. Others gasped in disbelief. Judge Branson called for order with sharp strikes of his gavel. Mancini, who had stood rigid awaiting the verdict, collapsed into his seat, hands covering his face. The judge thanked the jury for their service and formally discharged Mancini, though not without a stern admonition. The defendant was free to go, but he should understand that freedom was not the same as innocence. The jury had found reasonable doubt, not proof of accident. Mancini should reflect on his actions and the woman whose death would forever mark his life. Mancini left the courthouse through a side entrance shortly after 10 o'clock, surrounded by solicitors and well-wishers. Reporters shouted questions that went unanswered. He disappeared into the December night, a free man, but one forever associated with death and concealment. The trial was over, but the story would continue in newspapers and public memory, debated endlessly by those who believed justice had been served and those who believed a killer had escaped the gallows through eloquent advocacy. And throughout all of this, the testimony, the arguments, the verdict, the other trunk murder remained unsolved, its victim still nameless, its killer still unknown, a shadow that lurked beneath the public spectacle of Mancini's trial. Chapter 9. The Woman Without a Name. Winter settled over Brighton with the trial's conclusion. The Mancini verdict had satisfied public appetite for resolution, even as it left many convinced that justice had failed. But for Detective Chief Inspector Donaldson and the small team that remained assigned to the railway trunk murder, Mancini's acquittal was merely a distraction from the work that continued with diminishing hope. The woman whose torso had been discovered in June remained unidentified. Her killer remained free. And as 1934 drew toward its close, the investigation was approaching the point where active pursuit must give way to the cold status of an unsolved case. The final months of investigation followed patterns established in the summer, but with reduced resources and growing resignation. Every missing person report was still checked against the victim's description. Every tip from the public was still investigated, but the intensity had faded. Other crimes demanded attention. Other murders required solving. The Brighton trunk case had consumed thousands of man-hours and produced nothing definitive. At some point, the machinery of police work had to acknowledge futility and move forward. The identification efforts had been exhaustive. The appeal for information about missing women had been published in newspapers across Britain and in several European cities where English tourists might have travelled. Over 300 potential matches had been investigated. Each one had been eliminated through evidence of the woman being alive or dying at different times, or simply not matching the physical description closely enough. The list of possibilities had been narrowed to approximately 40 women who remained genuinely missing and whose descriptions aligned with the trunk victim. But 40 possibilities without means of confirmation was the same as no leads at all. Constance Clark remained among these possibilities, though her case had grown no clearer with time. Her mother in Bristol continued to believe her daughter was dead, killed in Brighton, her body dismembered and packed in the trunk that had waited at the railway station. But belief was not proof. Without the head, without hands, without any identifying feature beyond general physical similarity, Constance could neither be confirmed nor excluded as the victim. She existed in a terrible limbo, possibly dead, possibly alive somewhere under another name, possibly the subject of this investigation or possibly unconnected to it entirely. The dancer Margaret Bailey, who worked Brighton's waterfront, had never been located. Extensive efforts to trace her through the network of women who shared her profession had produced no results. No one had seen her since late May. No one knew her real name or where she had come from before Brighton. She had existed in the margins of society where people appeared and disappeared without documentation or notice. If she was the trunk victim, her death would forever go unrecorded in any official capacity beyond police files. If she was not the victim, she had vanished as completely as if she had never existed. Other names filled the list of unresolved cases. Alice Morris from Portsmouth, whose husband had reported her missing but seemed evasive under questioning. Ellen Shaw from London, a seamstress who had told her landlady she was visiting Brighton and never returned. Dorothy Wright from Southampton, last seen boarding a train to Brighton in early June. Each name represented a woman whose absence had been noted but whose fate remained unknown. Each one could be the victim. Each one could be alive somewhere. The investigation had no way to determine which. The forensic evidence had been examined until no further information could be extracted. The trunk had revealed nothing beyond its common manufacture. The wrapping materials were untraceable. The surgical precision of the dismemberment suggested medical knowledge, but provided no identification of the person who possessed such knowledge. Thousands of men in England had the skills necessary. Doctors, medical students, veterinarians, butchers, military surgeons. The field of potential suspects was simultaneously too broad and too vague to allow meaningful investigation. The King's Cross package containing the legs had been similarly exhaustive in its examination, and similarly unrevealing in its conclusions. The legs probably belonged to the Brighton torso. The handwriting on the package label probably matched handwriting samples from the Brighton trunk deposit, but probably was not certainly, and without the missing head and arms, the connection could never be definitively proven. The killer had divided the body between two locations, but in doing so had created ambiguity that protected their identity. Dr. Bainbridge prepared his final report on the case in late December. It was a document of medical precision and professional frustration. The victim was female, aged approximately 25 to 30, height 5 feet 2 inches, weight approximately 8 stone. She had been healthy prior to death. She had died approximately 2 weeks before discovery, likely in early June. The cause of death could not be determined without the head and neck. The dismemberment had been performed with surgical skill within 24 hours of death. The body had been kept in cool conditions before being packed in the trunk. Beyond these facts, medicine could say nothing more. The woman remained anonymous, her identity lost with the parts that had been taken from her. As winter deepened, practical considerations forced a decision that Donaldson had been dreading. The body could not remain in the mortuary indefinitely. Decomposition had progressed to the point where further preservation was impossible. The torso needed to be buried. The question was how to bury an unidentified victim with the dignity she deserved while acknowledging that she might someday be identified, and her family might wish to claim her remains. The decision was made to bury her in a numbered grave in a paupers section of Brighton's municipal cemetery. The location would be recorded precisely. A marker would be placed indicating the date of burial and the case reference number. If identification ever came, the grave could be located and the remains exhumed for proper burial by family. It was the best compromise between necessity and respect, though it satisfied no one who had worked the case. The burial took place on a grey morning in January of 1935. No ceremony was held, no mourners attended. Dr. Bainbridge was present, along with Donaldson and Detective Inspector Stacey. A police photographer documented the interment for official records. The coffin was plain wood, purchased with police funds. It was lowered into the cold ground while a cemetery worker stood by with a shovel. The marker was placed, a simple stone with a number and the year. Then the earth was replaced, and the woman whose name no one knew was committed to rest without the comfort of identity or the presence of anyone who had loved her. Donaldson stood at the graveside after the others had departed. The cemetery stretched around him, rows of markers indicating lives that had been lived and documented. People who had existed in the world with names and histories and connections to others. This woman had possessed all of those things. She had been born. She had lived. She had known people and been known by them. Somewhere, perhaps, someone wondered what had become of her. But that person had either not seen the appeals for information or had not recognized the generic description as matching someone they knew. And now she lay here, reduced to a case number, a file in a police station, a mystery that would never be solved. The investigation was officially classified as inactive but unsolved in February of 1935. The files would remain available. If new information emerged, they could be reopened. But active pursuit of leads ceased. The detectives assigned to the case were reassigned to other work. Donaldson returned to Scotland Yard and other investigations. The Brighton police returned to the ordinary crimes that filled their days: thefts, assaults, domestic disputes. Life continued. The newspapers moved on to other stories. The trunk murder received occasional mentions when anniversaries came around, or when other similar crimes occurred elsewhere in England. But the intense coverage of the summer of 1934 faded into memory. Brighton resumed its identity as a holiday destination. The railway station continued to serve thousands of travellers. The left luggage office continued to store trunks and packages. The horror of what had been discovered there became a footnote to the town's history, mentioned in guidebooks as a curiosity, discussed in pubs as an old mystery, but no longer dominating consciousness. Yet for those who had worked the case intimately, the failure to solve it remained a permanent wound. Donaldson would carry the woman's case file in his mind for the rest of his career. He would occasionally review it, wondering if he'd missed something, if some detail that had seemed insignificant contained the key to everything. Stacey kept copies of the photographs and witness statements, pulling them out periodically to review with fresh eyes, hoping that time and distance might reveal patterns invisible during the intensity of active investigation. The woman remained in her numbered grave as seasons passed. Spring came to Brighton, then summer, then autumn. The world moved forward. The Spanish Civil War began. King Edward the Faith ascended the throne. The concerns of 1934 receded into history. But in the Brighton police files, in the records of Scotland Yard, In the archives of newspapers and the memories of those who had lived through that summer, the trunk murder remained present, an unsolved mystery, a woman without a name, a killer who had escaped justice through careful planning and fortune. The grave in the paupers section received no visitors, no flowers were ever placed there, the simple marker weathered and aged. Moss grew in the carved numbers. The woman lay forgotten by all except a few detectives who had devoted months to finding her identity and failed. She represented something more than a single unsolved crime. She represented every victim whose death goes unwitnessed and unavenged, every person who vanishes without explanation, every story that ends without resolution. Her anonymity was complete and permanent, a darkness that no amount of investigation could illuminate. And in that darkness, her killer walked free, perhaps troubled by conscience, perhaps undisturbed, but certainly safe in the knowledge that some secrets, once buried deeply enough, remain buried forever. Chapter 10. The Sea's Silence. The decades rolled forward with the relentless motion of time itself, and Brighton changed as all places change, its streets redrawn, its buildings replaced, its population renewed with each generation. The railway station where trunk number 102 had been discovered underwent renovations in the 1950s. The left luggage office was relocated, then eventually eliminated entirely as patterns of travel shifted. The very space where William Vinicum had noticed a dark stain spreading from an unremarkable trunk was absorbed into a coffee shop, then a newspaper kiosk, its history unmarked and unknown to the travellers who passed through. Yet the story endured, passed down through the peculiar immortality granted to unsolved mysteries. The Brighton trunk murders, the plural always used despite one case being solved, became part of the town's darker folklore, told alongside tales of smugglers and shipwrecks, ghost stories, and criminal legends. True crime enthusiasts studied the case, wrote articles and books proposing theories that ranged from plausible to fantastical. Some claimed the killer had been a doctor whose name appeared in the investigation files, but who had escaped suspicion through social connections. Others suggested the crime was connected to illegal abortion networks that operated in seaside towns. Still, others wove elaborate conspiracies involving foreign spies or aristocratic cover-ups. Detective Chief Inspector Donaldson retired from Scotland Yard in 1946, 12 years after the trunk murder had consumed his summer. He had solved many cases in the intervening years, brought numerous killers to justice, earned commendations and respect throughout the Metropolitan Police. Yet in interviews late in his life, when asked about unsolved cases that troubled him, he always returned to Brighton. The woman in the trunk haunted him not because of the crime's brutality, he had seen worse, but because of the completeness of her erasure. Someone had not simply killed her, but had erased her very existence, stripping away everything that made her identifiable, consigning her to eternal anonymity. In 1961, a true crime writer named Leonard Gribble published a book examining famous unsolved murders, devoting a chapter to the Brighton trunk case. Gribble had interviewed retired detectives and reviewed archived newspapers, attempting to construct a definitive account. His conclusion, after exhaustive research, was that the victim had likely been a prostitute or woman of uncertain occupation, killed by someone with medical training, possibly a doctor performing an illegal abortion that had gone fatally wrong. The dismemberment had been done to prevent identification through dental records or distinctive physical features. The killer had successfully evaded detection through careful planning and sheer luck. This theory became widely accepted, repeated in subsequent books and articles. It had the appeal of logic and the weight of expert opinion, yet it remained speculation, no more provable than any other explanation. Without identification of the victim, without confession from the killer, without physical evidence connecting to a suspect, all theories were essentially fiction imposed upon ambiguous facts. The grave in Brighton Cemetery remained marked only by its number through the decades. In 1974, on the 40th anniversary of the trunk discovery, a local historical society placed a small plaque near the burial site. It read simply, "In memory of an unknown woman, died June 1934. Her identity and her killer never discovered." The gesture was modest but significant, an acknowledgement that even in anonymity the dead deserved recognition. Technology advanced through the later decades of the 20th century in ways that might have solved the case had they existed in 1934. DNA analysis could have definitively matched the King's Cross legs to the Brighton torso. Modern forensic techniques might have extracted trace evidence from the trunk or wrapping materials. Computer databases could have cross-referenced missing persons reports more efficiently than the manual systems available to Donaldson's team, but these advances came too late. The physical evidence had long since been destroyed or lost. The witnesses had aged and died. The trail had gone permanently cold. In 1996, a journalist researching the case discovered an intriguing detail in archived police records. During the initial investigation, a doctor named Edward Messiah had been briefly questioned because he lived near Park Crescent and had access to medical facilities. He had provided an alibi that checked out and the investigation had moved on. But the journalist discovered that Messiah had died in 1953, and according to his death certificate, he had lived at various addresses in Brighton during the 1930s, including a flat on Kemp Street, very near the railway station. The proximity was suggestive but proved nothing. Messiah could not be questioned, being 4 decades dead. His medical records had been destroyed. The discovery generated newspaper articles and television documentaries, but no actual answers. Tony Mancini lived until 1976, dying at age 68 in London. In his final years, he gave several interviews about the trial that had made him briefly famous. He maintained consistently that Violette K's death had been accidental, that his acquittal had been justified, that he had suffered for decades from the stigma of being associated with murder. Yet some who interviewed him detected hints of something darker beneath his protests. In a conversation recorded shortly before his death, he reportedly said that the truth of what happened in Park Crescent died with Violette, a statement ambiguous enough to suggest either innocence wrongly accused or guilt successfully concealed. The Brighton promenade, where Violette and Mancini had once walked arm in arm, where holiday makers had strolled in the summer of 1934 unaware of the horrors hidden in railway station luggage rooms, continued to attract visitors through the turn of the millennium. The piers were rebuilt and modernised. The hotels underwent renovations. The town's character evolved, but certain elements persisted. The sound of the sea, the cry of gulls, the particular quality of light that reflected off the channel waters. In 2004, 70 years after the trunk discovery, the Brighton police briefly reopened the case files as part of a review of unsolved historical crimes. Modern detectives examined the evidence with fresh eyes and contemporary forensic knowledge. They concluded what their predecessors had known. Without identification of the victim, without new physical evidence, without living witnesses, the case could not be solved. The victim's identity remained lost to time. The killer, if still alive, would be over 90 years old. More likely they had died decades earlier, taking their secret to the grave. The detective who led this review, Inspector Sarah Collins, wrote in her report that the Brighton trunk murder represented a particular type of tragedy, a crime so carefully executed that justice became impossible. The killer had understood what they needed to hide and had hidden it thoroughly. They had anticipated the investigative techniques of their era and had countered them successfully. Whether through luck or skill, or some combination of both, they had achieved what every murderer seeks: complete escape from consequence. The file was closed again, this time with the understanding that it would likely never reopen. The case had passed beyond the reach of active investigation into the realm of historical curiosity. The woman in the pauper's grave remained there, her identity still unknown. while above her the seasons changed and the years accumulated, and the living went about their concerns unmindful of the dead who rested beneath. The Brighton of the 21st century bore little resemblance to the town of 1934. The railway station had been rebuilt, the streets had been repaved. The people who had witnessed the trunk discovery, who had participated in the investigation, who had attended Mancini's trial, had all passed into history themselves. Yet the story persisted, retold in books and podcasts and television documentaries, each generation discovering it anew and attempting to solve what previous generations had failed to resolve. The mystery had become its own kind of monument, not to the killer's cleverness or the police's failure, but to the fragility of identity itself. The case demonstrated how easily a person could be erased, how thoroughly a life could be obscured. Without the markers of identity that society used to define individuals, name, face, fingerprints, connections to others, a person became anonymous even in death. The woman in the trunk had been someone. She had possessed a name that people spoke. She had lived in a place where she was known. She had perhaps been loved, or at least noticed. All of that had been taken from her, first by her killer and then by time's passage. The sea continued its eternal rhythm against Brighton's beaches, waves advancing and retreating with tidal regularity unchanged since centuries before humans had built their town upon these cliffs. The water kept its secrets as it had always done, accepting what was given to it. Shipwrecks and drownings, objects thrown from piers, perhaps even parts of a dismembered body that had never been recovered. The channel was indifferent to human tragedy, washing its shores clean with each tide, maintaining its vast silence. On quiet evenings, when the crowds had left and the promenade stood empty beneath street lamps, it was still possible to imagine Brighton as it had been in 1934. The fundamental geography remained, the curve of the bay, the slope of the cliffs, the line where land met water. In such moments, the past felt close, separated not by years but by the thinnest of veils. One could almost see the figures walking those older streets, conducting their investigations, searching for answers that would never come. The woman in the numbered grave remained there, undisturbed, her story incomplete. She represented all the unsolved mysteries that accumulate in the corners of history, the questions without answers, the tragedies without resolution, the deaths without justice. Her killer had succeeded in erasing her, but in doing so had inadvertently granted her a kind of immortality. She would be remembered not for who she was, but for what she represented. The limits of human knowledge, the persistence of darkness, the uncomfortable truth that some crimes remain forever unpunished. The files of the Brighton trunk murder sat in archives, available to researchers and historians, but yielding no new insights with each examination. The facts remained immutable. The conclusions remained ambiguous. The case was closed but never solved, finished but never completed, a story that ended in the middle of its telling. And so the years continued their march. Brighton prospered and declined and prospered again. The railway station served new generations of travellers. The cemetery where the woman lay accumulated more graves, more markers, more names carved in stone. Life persisted with its usual disregard for past tragedies. But in the persistent memory of this one unsolved crime, something remained, a testament to a woman whose name was lost, whose death was unavenged, whose killer escaped into the anonymous crowds of history. The sea kept its silence, the stone marked its number, and in the gathering darkness of another evening, another century, another world far removed from that summer of 1934, the mystery remained, suspended forever in the moment before resolution, locked in the permanent limbo of the unsolved, a question mark etched into the history of a seaside town where pleasure and horror had once occupied the same spaces, separated only by the thin boundaries between what was known and what was hidden. The candle burned low, the chamber fell silent, and history, once again, turned the page in the dark. This concludes our journey through the Brighton trunk murders of 1934. The mystery of the woman in trunk number 102 remains unsolved to this day, one of England's most enduring cold cases, a reminder that some secrets remain forever buried in the shadows of the past.